Get that cheap trash out of my sight before she ruins the aesthetic." That was the first thing Victoria Thorne said when she saw her son's girlfriend. She laughed, swirling her vintage Dom Perignon, unaware that the woman standing before her in a $15 thrift store dress wasn't just a struggling waitress. She was Grace Vance, the hidden owner of the very hotel chain they were standing in. Victoria thought she was crushing a peasant, but she was actually declaring war on a billionaire. And by the time the dessert was served, the Thorne family legacy would be nothing but ash. This is the story of the ultimate regret. The fabric was itchy. That was the first thing Grace Vance noticed as she adjusted the strap of the floral midi dress she had purchased from a Goodwill in downtown Chicago 3 hours ago. It was a synthetic blend, stiff and unforgiving against her skin, which was used to the caress of mulberry silk and Egyptian cotton. The price tag, which she had carefully removed, read $14. Grace stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in her penthouse apartment, though, for the last 6 months, she had told her boyfriend, Julian Thorne, that she was house-sitting for a wealthy friend. She looked at her reflection. No Cartier earrings, no Patek Philippe watch, just Grace. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, secured with a simple black elastic tie. She wore hardly any makeup, just a touch of mascara and lip balm. She looked entirely ordinary, and that was exactly the point. "Are you sure about this, Miss Vance?" Grace turned to see Marcus, her head of security and long-time confidant, standing by the doorway. He looked pained, holding her usual clutch, a limited edition Hermes Birkin, which she was leaving behind tonight in favor of a worn-out faux leather bag from Target. "I have to be, Marcus," Grace said, her voice steady, but her hands trembling slightly. "Julian proposed last week. He wants to marry me. But he's terrified of his mother. He keeps saying she's particular. I need to know if the Thornes will accept Grace, the struggling freelance writer, or if they only want a piece of a fortune they don't even know I have." Marcus sighed, checking his watch. "The Thorne family is complicated. My background check on Victoria and Edward Thorne suggests they are heavily leveraged. They have the social standing, the country club memberships in Greenwich, but their liquidity is drying up. They are desperate for a cash injection." "Exactly," Grace said, grabbing the cheap purse. "If they treat a poor girl with dignity, I'll pay off their debts the morning after the wedding without blinking. I'll change their lives. But if they don't..." Her eyes hardened. "Well, I need to know before I walk down the aisle." Her phone buzzed. It was Julian. "I'm downstairs, babe. You ready?" Grace took a deep breath. She wasn't Grace Vance, the CEO of Vance Global, the woman who had just acquired a majority stake in a Silicon Valley tech giant last Tuesday. Tonight, she was just Grace, the girl who clipped coupons and took the bus. She walked out of the penthouse, took the service elevator down to the side street so the doorman wouldn't salute her, and walked around the corner to where Julian's modest Honda Civic was idling. Julian Thorne was a good man. He had kind eyes the color of warm whiskey and a smile that made Grace forget about her board meetings. He stepped out of the car to open her door, a habit he never broke. When he saw her, his expression didn't falter. He didn't look at the cheap dress with disdain. He looked at her face. "You look beautiful," he said, kissing her cheek. "But are you sure you're warm enough? The AC at the venue might be strong." "I'll be fine," Grace lied. "I wanted to look nice for your parents. Is it too much, or not enough?" Julian hesitated, a shadow of anxiety crossing his face. He rubbed the back of his neck. "It's perfect, Elle. Really. It's just... my mother. She's a little intense about presentation, but don't worry about her. I love you. That's what matters. He was trying to protect her. Grace could see the tension in his jaw. He was terrified of this meeting, not because he was ashamed of Grace, but because he knew exactly who his mother was. The drive to the venue was quiet. They were heading to the Chatsworth estate, a sprawling historic manor just outside the city limits that had been converted into an exclusive event venue. Ironically, Vance Global had been in talks to buy the Chatsworth for its boutique hotel portfolio, but Grace had put the deal on hold. As they turned into the long, gravel driveway lined with century-old oaks, the magnitude of the wealth on display became undeniable. A line of Bentleys, Rolls-Royces, and G-Wagons snaked toward the valet. Julian's Honda Civic looked like a toy car amidst the heavy metal of the aristocracy. The valet, a young man named Kevin who looked exhausted, hesitated for a split second before opening Julian's door. "Relax," Julian whispered, squeezing Grace's hand. "Just be yourself." Grace stepped out. The humid night air clung to her polyester dress. She looked up at the towering stone facade of the estate, bathed in golden uplighting. She felt a knot in her stomach. In her world, she could buy this building 3 times over. But tonight, she was walking into the lion's den with nothing but a shield of poverty. She didn't know it yet, but the trap had already been set. Victoria Thorne wasn't just waiting for her son's girlfriend, she was waiting for a victim. The grand ballroom of the Chatsworth estate was a sensory overload of crystal, velvet, and old money arrogance. A string quartet played softly in the corner, the music barely rising above the hum of polite, hushed gossip. The air smelled of expensive perfume, Chanel No. 5 and Baccarat Rouge, and the distinct metallic scent of caviar. Grace walked arm in arm with Julian, acutely aware of the sound her shoes made. They were simple flats, not the clicking stilettos that the other women wore. Every woman in the room seemed to be over 6 feet tall, draped in silk gowns that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. "Julian, darling." The voice cut through the room like a diamond cutter. Standing near the center of the room, holding court near a massive ice sculpture of a swan, was Victoria Thorne. Victoria was a woman who had been beautiful once, but years of cosmetic surgery had pulled her face into a permanent expression of surprised disdain. She wore a blood-red gown that was cut aggressively low and a diamond necklace that looked heavy enough to bruise her collarbone. Beside her stood Beatrice, Julian's younger sister, who was scrolling through her phone, looking bored. Beatrice was a carbon copy of her mother, dressed in silver, with a sneer that seemed painted on. Julian stiffened. "Hi, Mother. You look lovely." Victoria didn't look at Julian. Her eyes locked instantly onto Grace. The gaze wasn't just cold, it was clinical. It started at Grace's messy bun, traveled down the off-brand dress, paused at the scuffed flats, and finally landed on the faux leather handbag. For a terrifying 5 seconds, Victoria said nothing. The silence was loud enough to stop the conversation of the 3 couples nearest to them. "So," Victoria finally said, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. "This is Helen?" "Grace," Julian corrected, his voice tight. "Mother, this is Grace, my fiancée." Victoria let out a short, sharp laugh, like a bark. "Fiancée? Oh, Julian, stop teasing. We haven't even had the engagement party properly." She finally extended a hand to Grace, but she didn't offer a handshake. She held her hand out, limp, palm down, as if expecting it to be kissed, or for Grace to take something from it. Grace shook it firmly. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Thorne. Julian speaks so highly of you." "Does he?" Victoria withdrew her hand quickly, wiping it subtly on the side of her gown. "He tells me you're a writer?" "That's right," Grace said, sticking to the script. I write freelance articles for travel blogs and local papers." "Freelance?" Beatrice chimed in, not looking up from her phone. "That's code for unemployed, right?" "Beatrice!" Julian snapped. "What?" Beatrice looked up, her eyes wide and innocent. "I'm just asking. I mean, look at her, Julian. She looks like she just came from a shifts at a diner. Did you lose your luggage, honey? Is that why you're wearing that?" Beatrice gestured vaguely at Grace's dress. Several guests nearby covered their mouths to hide their snickers. Grace felt the heat rise in her cheeks. It wasn't shame, it was anger. But she forced herself to smile. "I believe that style isn't about the price tag, Beatrice. It's about how you carry yourself." Victoria's eyes narrowed. She didn't like being challenged. How quaint. A philosopher. "Julian, darling, why don't you go get us some drinks? The dry martinis here are passable, barely." "I'm not leaving Grace alone," Julian said firmly. "Oh, don't be ridiculous," Victoria waved a hand. "I just want to get to know her, woman to woman, unless she needs a chaperone." Julian looked torn. He looked at Grace. "I'll be right back. 2 minutes." "I'll be fine," Grace assured him, though her instincts were screaming that this was a tactical separation. As soon as Julian disappeared into the crowd toward the bar, the temperature in the circle dropped 20 degrees. Victoria stepped closer, invading Grace's personal space. The smell of alcohol on her breath was potent. "Let's cut the crap, shall we?" Victoria whispered. The posh accent was gone, replaced by something gritty and menacing. "Excuse me?" Grace asked. "You think I don't know what you are?" Victoria hissed. "You're a gold digger. You saw my soft-hearted idiot son. You saw the last name, and you thought you hit the jackpot. You think you can drag him down into your mediocrity?" "I love your son, Mrs. Thorne," Grace said calmly. "I don't care about his money." "Please," Beatrice scoffed. "Everyone cares about money, especially people who dress like they shop at a garage sale. Look around you, Grace. Do you see these people? The senator over there. The CEO of Trident Oil. This is our world. You are a stain on this carpet." "I'm willing to sign a prenup," Grace said, testing them. "I don't want anything from the Thorne estate." Victoria laughed, a cruel, tinkling sound. "A prenup? Darling, you won't get close enough to an altar to sign one. Listen to me carefully. Tonight, a very special guest is arriving. Her name is Clarissa van der Hoven. Her father owns the shipping lines in the North Atlantic. She is who Julian is supposed to marry. She is sophistication, she is class, and she is rich." "Julian chose me," Grace said. "Julian is a child who doesn't know what's good for him," Victoria snapped. "Here is how tonight is going to go. You are going to stay in the corner, you are going to keep your mouth shut, and when Clarissa arrives, you are going to see exactly what Julian deserves. And if you make a scene? If you embarrass us?" Victoria leaned in, her manicured nail hovering inches from Grace's chest. "I will ruin you. I have friends in the publishing industry. I'll make sure you never sell another one of your pathetic little blog posts again. I will make you unemployable. Do you understand me?" Grace looked into Victoria's eyes. She saw fear there. Deep, desperate fear masked by aggression. Victoria wasn't protecting her son. She was protecting an investment. She needed Julian to marry this Clarissa woman because the Thornes were broke. Grace smiled, a slow, dangerous smile that Victoria didn't quite understand. "I understand perfectly, Mrs. Thorne," Grace said softly. "I'll stay right here." "Oh, I'll stay," Grace thought, "and I'm going to watch you burn." Just then, a commotion stirred at the entrance. The heavy oak doors swung open. "Ah!" Victoria clapped her hands, her face instantly transforming back into a mask of delight. "She's here. Beatrice, straighten your posture." Victoria shoved past Grace as if she were a piece of furniture. "Move aside, dear. Someone important is walking in." Grace turned to see who this savior was. Walking through the door was a tall, stunning blonde woman in a shimmering gold dress, flanked by photographers, Clarissa van der Hoven. But it wasn't Clarissa that caught Grace's attention. It was the man walking 2 steps behind Clarissa, carrying her shawl. Grace froze. The man was Arthur Pendleton. Arthur Pendleton was the chief financial officer of Vance Global. He was Grace's CFO, and he was currently laughing at something Clarissa said. If Arthur saw Grace, if he recognized his boss in a polyester dress, the game would be up instantly. Or worse, if Arthur was here, it meant the Thorns were trying to do business with her company without her knowing. Grace quickly grabbed a tray of hors d'oeuvres from a passing waiter, holding a napkin up to her face, ducking behind a large fern. This, Grace whispered to herself, just got a lot more complicated. Grace Vance had negotiated billion-dollar mergers while suffering from the flu. She had stared down hostile boards of directors in Tokyo and New York, but hiding behind a decorative ficus plant in a ballroom in Connecticut felt like the most stressful moment of her career. She watched through the leaves as Arthur Pendleton, her CFO, shook hands with Edward Thorne, Julian's father. Edward was a shorter man than his wife, balding and sweating profusely despite the cool air conditioning. He looked like a man who was juggling chainsaws. "Mr. Pendleton," Edward said, his voice booming a little too loudly. "So glad you could join us. And this must be the lovely Clarissa." "Charmed," Clarissa said, barely looking at him. She was scanning the room, presumably for Julian. Grace's mind raced. Why is Arthur here? Then it clicked. A few weeks ago, a loan application had crossed her desk for a failing hospitality group in the tri-state area. She hadn't looked at the name of the applicant. She had simply rejected it because the collateral was over-leveraged. The applicant had appealed to the CFO directly. The Thorns weren't just broke. They were trying to borrow money from her company to pay for this party. "Grace?" Julian appeared at her elbow, holding 2 glasses of white wine. "What are you doing back here? You look like you're hiding from the mob." Grace straightened up, quickly turning her back to Arthur's direction. "Just admiring the flora. Julian, that man over there with Clarissa." "Who is he?" Julian glanced over. "That's Arthur something. He's some big-shot financier. My father is trying to get a loan from his firm. Apparently, if we don't secure the funding by Monday, things are going to get difficult. But don't worry about that. Dad always figures it out." Grace took the wine glass, her hand gripping the stem tight. Monday. They were days away from bankruptcy, yet Victoria was wearing a necklace worth a house. "Come on," Julian said, taking her hand. "Mother wants us at the head table. She says she wants everyone together." "Julian, maybe I should sit at one of the side tables," Grace suggested, desperate to avoid Arthur's line of sight. "I don't want to intrude." "Nonsense," Julian smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Your family, or you will be." They walked toward the long banquet table, set up on a dais at the front of the room. It was a display of pure narcissism. The table was elevated, so the rest of the guests had to look up at the Thorns. As they approached, Victoria was rearranging the place cards. She saw them coming and flashed a tight, predatory smile. "Just in time," Victoria chirped. "Julian, darling, you sit here." She pointed to the seat directly to her right. "And Clarissa, you sit next to Julian. You two have so much to catch up on." "And Grace?" Julian asked, his voice hardening. "Oh," Victoria waved a dismissive hand toward the far end of the table, near the kitchen service door. There wasn't enough room in the center settings. "Grace, dear, You can squeeze in down there next to Uncle Silas. He's deaf in one ear, so you won't have to worry about making conversation. It's better for everyone, really. You wouldn't be able to keep up with the business talk anyway. It was a deliberate slight, the kid's table placement for the fiancé. No, Julian said. He reached out and grabbed the place card, reading Clarissa van der Hoven, and swapped it with Grace's. Grace sits with me. The table went silent. Victoria's face turned a shade of violet. Clarissa, who had just walked up, stopped in her tracks. Julian? Clarissa purred, touching his arm. Don't be rude. Your mother has worked so hard on the seating chart. It's fine, Grace whispered to Julian. She realized that if she sat next to Julian, she would be directly across from Arthur. She needed distance. I'll sit at the end, Julian. Really? It's fine. She walked to the end of the table before he could stop her. She sat down next to Uncle Silas, an elderly man who was currently asleep, and, crucially, she was seated behind a massive floral centerpiece that blocked her face from the center of the table where Arthur was sitting. Dinner was served. It was a 6-course affair, starting with lobster bisque. Grace kept her head down, eating quickly and quietly. But she was listening. Her hearing was sharp, and the acoustics of the table carried the conversation from the center perfectly. So, Mr. Pendleton, Edward Thorne's voice wafted over. As you can see, the Chatsworth estate is a gold mine. We are merely facing a liquidity pinch. A short-term bridge loan of $5 million would be paid back within the quarter. Grace nearly choked on her soup. $5 million? Based on the background check Marcus had run, the estate was already mortgaged twice. They had 0 equity. It's a lovely property. Arthur's voice was cautious. But Vance Global is very strict about collateral. Ms. Vance, our CEO, has a policy against lending to high-risk luxury assets without a controlling stake. Ms. Vance, Victoria scoffed loudly. I've heard of her. A recluse, isn't she? Probably some frumpy spinster who inherited her daddy's money and doesn't know how to spend it. If she came to a party like this, she'd faint. Grace gripped her spoon. Frumpy spinster. She looked down at her polyester dress. Well played, Victoria. Actually, Arthur said defensively, Ms. Vance is a brilliant strategist, and she built the company up from her grandfather's initial investment by 10-fold. Boring, Beatrice interrupted, leaning over the table to flash a smile at Arthur. Let's talk about something else. Clarissa, tell us about your trip to Milan. Oh, it was divine, Clarissa said, flipping her hair and leaning her shoulder into Julian. Julian, do you remember that cafe we went to 3 years ago? The one by the Duomo? I went back there and I just missed you so much. Julian shifted uncomfortably. That was a long time ago, Clarissa. Not that long, Victoria interjected. You two were practically inseparable. Grace, do you have a passport? No, probably not. Travel is so expensive when you're living paycheck to paycheck. Victoria raised her voice so the insult carried down the table. Grace looked up. She caught Victoria's eye. Actually, Mrs. Thorne, I find that travel is less about money and more about perspective. Some people go around the world and see nothing but hotel rooms. Is that right? Victoria sneered. And what would you know about hotel rooms? You probably cleaned them. Beatrice giggled. Even Edward chuckled nervously. Grace took a deep breath. She pulled her phone out under the table and sent a text to Marcus, who was parked in the security van outside. Text to Marcus. They are trying to scam Arthur for 5 matters. Get me the Thorne dossier, the full unredacted version. I want to know where every skeleton is buried. Bring it to the side door in 10 minutes. She was done playing nice. She was going to wait until dessert, and then she was going to expose them. But she didn't know that Victoria had a plan to get rid of her long before the cake was cut. The waiters cleared the soup bowls and brought out the main course, filet mignon with truffle reduction. The atmosphere at the table was suffocating. Julian was barely eating, his jaw clenched tight as Clarissa continued to drape herself over him, whispering inside jokes in his ear. Grace watched from the end of the table. She felt a strange mixture of pity and rage. Julian was trapped. He had been raised by wolves who convinced him he was a sheep. "Excuse me," Grace said softly to the waiter. "Could I get some water?" "Champagne for the table," Edward announced loudly, ignoring her. "To celebrate." "Celebrate what, Father?" Julian asked sharply. "Why, the future, of course." Edward raised his glass, sweat trickling down his temple. "To the Thorn legacy, and to new partnerships." He winked clumsily at Clarissa. Beatrice, who had been drinking steadily since she arrived, suddenly stood up. She held a glass of dark, heavy Cabernet Sauvignon. "I want to make a toast, too," Beatrice slurred slightly. She walked around the table. She wasn't walking toward her father. She was walking toward the end of the table, toward Grace. Grace tensed. She saw the look in Beatrice's eyes. It was malicious glee. "To Grace," Beatrice shouted, drawing the attention of the entire ballroom. The music stopped. Hundreds of eyes turned to the head table. "For showing us all that. Charity is important." Beatrice stumbled. It was a fake stumble, theatrical and poorly acted. She lunged forward, and the entire glass of red wine went airborne. It wasn't a splash. It was a deluge. The wine hit Grace squarely in the chest. It soaked the floral polyester instantly, turning the pink flowers into a dripping, blood-red mess. It splashed up onto her neck and chin. It dripped onto the white tablecloth. The room gasped. "Oh my God!" Beatrice cried, covering her mouth with a hand that was shaking with suppressed laughter. "I am so clumsy. Oh, look at you. You're a mess." Grace sat frozen. The cold liquid seeped through the cheap fabric, chilling her skin. She felt the humiliation burn hot in her chest. She looked up and saw Victoria smiling. It was a small, satisfied smile. "Beatrice, do be careful," Victoria drawled, not moving a muscle to help. Although, honestly, that dress was a disaster before the wine. Maybe it's an improvement. "That is enough." The chair scrapped loudly against the floor. Julian stood up so fast, his chair fell backward with a crash. "Julian, sit down," Edward hissed. "Don't make a scene." "You made the scene," Julian shouted, his face red with fury. He grabbed his napkin and rushed to the end of the table. He knelt beside Grace, dabbing frantically at the wine on her dress. "Elle, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Julian," Grace said quietly. Her voice was steady, eerily calm. She stood up. As she stood, the centerpiece that had been blocking her view of the center table was no longer an obstacle. She was standing tall, the lights of the chandelier hitting her face. Arthur Pendleton, who had been watching the scene with a look of polite horror, suddenly froze. He squinted. He adjusted his glasses. Grace looked directly at him. Arthur's mouth dropped open. He started to stand up. Miss Va. Grace locked eyes with him and gave a nearly imperceptible shake of her head. She put a finger to her lips for a split second. "Sit down, Arthur." Arthur, trained to follow her commands instinctively, sank back into his chair, looking like he had seen a ghost. He looked from Grace in her wine-soaked rag to Victoria in her diamonds, and a look of dawning realization and terror crossed his face. He realized exactly what was happening. His boss was undercover, and these people had just assaulted her. "Julian," Victoria called out, her voice icy. "Leave her." She needs to go to the washroom and clean herself up. Or better yet, she should probably just go home. She doesn't fit in here, darling. Look at her. She's a stained rug. She's the woman I love, Julian yelled. The entire ballroom was silent now. And you treat her like garbage. I'm done, Mother. I'm leaving with her. If you walk out those doors, Edward Thorne stood up, his voice trembling with desperation, you are cut off. You hear me, Julian? No trust fund, no apartment, no access to the accounts. You leave with nothing but the clothes on your back. Julian looked at his father. Then he looked at Grace. He took her hand, his grip tight. Keep the money, Julian spat. I'd rather be poor with her than rich with you. Grace's heart swelled. He had passed the test. He had chosen her when she had nothing to offer but a stained dress and a humiliated reputation. Julian, Grace said, her voice projecting clearly across the silent room. Wait. We're leaving, Elle, Julian said, pulling her gently. We don't need this. No, Grace said firmly. She pulled her hand back. She picked up a clean napkin and wiped the wine from her chin. She looked at Victoria, then at Edward, and finally at Clarissa. I think, Grace said, her voice changing. The softness was gone. The struggling writer persona evaporated. In its place was the voice that commanded boardrooms. It was cold, precise, and terrifyingly confident. I think we should stay for dessert. I hear the cake is delicious. Excuse me? Victoria blinked, confused by the sudden shift in tone. You insolent little... Actually, Grace interrupted her, stepping forward. She walked toward the center of the table. I have a few questions about this bridge loan you're discussing with Mr. Pendleton. You? Edward laughed nervously. What would you know about high finance, girl? Go dry off. Grace ignored him. She looked at Arthur. Mr. Pendleton, Grace said clearly. What is the current valuation of the Chatsworth estate, according to the Thornes application? Arthur stood up immediately. He buttoned his suit jacket, bowing his head slightly toward Grace. The room murmured. Why was the billionaire financier bowing to the waitress? The application states a valuation of $40 million, ma'am, Arthur said, his voice respectful and professional. Ma'am? Beatrice squinted. Why are you calling her ma'am? And, Grace continued, walking behind Edward's chair, what did the independent audit say the estate is actually worth, considering the black mold in the East Wing and the outstanding liens from the IRS? Edward's face went white. How do you know about the liens? The audit values the estate at negative $3 million, Arthur answered. It is essentially worthless. Lies! Victoria shrieked. Who do you think you are? Grace stopped directly behind Victoria's chair. She leaned down, close to Victoria's ear, but spoke loud enough for the microphone on the table to pick it up. I think it's time for a proper introduction, Grace said. She looked at the ballroom doors. The doors swung open. Marcus walked in. He wasn't alone. He was accompanied by 4 uniformed police officers and a man in a sharp grey suit holding a briefcase. Who I am, Grace said, looking at Victoria's terrified reflection in the wine glass, is the person who owns the bank you're trying to defraud, and I'm the person who just bought the mortgage on this house this morning. Grace smiled. I'm Grace Vance, CEO of Vance Global, and you are sitting in my chair. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. It was the kind of silence that usually follows a gunshot. Victoria Thorne blinked, her false eyelashes fluttering rapidly as her brain tried to process the information. She looked at the woman in the wine-stained polyester dress. She looked at the wine dripping onto the floor. And then she looked at Arthur Pendleton, the most powerful financier in the room, who was standing deferentially with his head bowed toward this waitress. This is a joke." Victoria laughed nervously, looking around at the guests. "This is some sort of sick performance art joke. Julian, tell your little girlfriend to stop playing pretend. It's embarrassing." "It is not a joke, Mrs. Thorne," Arthur Pendleton said, his voice cutting through the room like a gavel. He walked around the table and stood beside Grace. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents stamped with the official seal of the Vance Global Legal Department. "This," Arthur said, holding up a blue folder, "is the deed to the Chatsworth estate. As of 9 a.m. this morning, the bank foreclosed on your outstanding loans due to non-payment and breach of contract. Ms. Vance's holding company purchased the debt immediately." "Foreclosed?" Edward Thorne gasped, clutching his chest. "But we had until Monday. We had an agreement with the bank manager." "The bank manager works for me now," Grace said calmly. She took the napkin and wiped the last of the wine from her hands. She didn't shout. She didn't scream. She spoke with the quiet, terrifying authority of a woman who controlled billions. "And when I saw the application come across my desk, an application filled with fraudulent asset valuations, I decided to personally oversee the acquisition." Grace signaled to the man in the grey suit, her personal attorney, Mr. Sterling. Mr. Sterling stepped forward. "Mr. Edward Thorne, Mrs. Victoria Thorne, you are currently trespassing on private property owned by Vance Holdings. Furthermore, these officers are here regarding the loan application you submitted to Vance Global." "What? What about it?" Edward stammered, sweat pouring into his eyes. "It's called bank fraud, Edward," Grace said, stepping closer. "You listed the family jewelry collection as collateral, but according to my insurance adjusters, you sold those diamonds 3 years ago to pay off gambling debts in Macau. Trying to secure a loan with non-existent assets is a federal crime." The color drained from Victoria's face. She looked at the police officers who were now moving up the steps of the dais. "No," Victoria whispered. "You can't do this. We are the Thornes. We are pillars of this community." "You are broke, Victoria," Grace said coldly. "And you are bullies. You thought you could crush a girl because she wore a cheap dress. You thought poverty was a character flaw. But the only flaw here is your arrogance." Suddenly, Beatrice, who had been standing frozen with her empty wine glass, let out a screech. "This is insane! Mother, do something! Throw her out!" Victoria turned on Grace, her eyes wild. "You tricked us! You lied! You came into my house under false pretenses." "I came into this house as myself," Grace countered. "I introduced myself as Grace. I told you I was a writer, which I am. I write all my own shareholder letters. I told you I loved your son. The only thing I didn't tell you was my net worth. And because of that, you treated me like a dog." Grace looked at the guests, who were watching with rapt attention. "Let this be a lesson," Grace announced to the room. "The way you treat the waiter is more important than how you treat the CEO, because you never know when the waiter is the CEO." She turned to the police. "Officers, I would like these trespassers removed from my property, immediately." "Wait!" Edward shouted as an officer grabbed his arm. Clarissa, tell them who we are." Everyone turned to look at Clarissa van der Hoeven. The shipping heiress was already standing up, her purse clutched tight. She looked at the police, then at the ruined Thorne family, and then at Grace Vance, a woman she knew by reputation to be the most powerful shark in the business world. Clarissa let out a sharp, uncomfortable laugh. I hardly know these people," she said, stepping away from the table. "I was just hired for the appearance. My agent said it was a charity gala." "Charity gala?" Julian repeated, looking at Clarissa. You said you missed me. You said we had history. Clarissa rolled her eyes. Oh, grow up, Julian. Your mother paid me $10,000 to fly in and make your girlfriend jealous. I don't even remember dating you. Julian looked as if he had been punched in the gut. The deception was total. His mother hadn't just been rude, she had orchestrated a theatrical production to destroy his relationship. Take them away, Grace said, turning her back on them. You witch! Victoria screamed as the officers handcuffed her. I'll sue you. You'll do nothing, Arthur Pendleton said calmly, because you won't be able to afford a lawyer. As the Thorns were dragged out of their own party, kicking, screaming, and pleading, the room erupted into chaos. The guests began frantically texting, calling, and gossiping. The music had stopped. The illusion of the Thorn dynasty had shattered in spectacular fashion. Grace stood alone at the head of the table. She felt a rush of adrenaline, but also a strange hollowness. She had won. She had destroyed the people who hurt her. She had protected her company. She turned to look for Julian. She expected him to be smiling. She expected him to run to her, to hug her, to celebrate their victory over his toxic family. But Julian wasn't smiling. He was standing 10 feet away, staring at her as if she were a stranger. The ballroom was emptying. The guests, realizing the party was over and not wanting to be associated with a crime scene, were fleeing to their Bentleys. Grace walked down the steps of the dais, her wine-soaked dress sticking to her legs. She approached Julian. Julian, she said, reaching out for his hand. We did it. They can't hurt us anymore. I can pay off the legal fees. I can make sure your dad gets a plea deal if you want, or we can just let them. Julian pulled his hand away. The motion was sharp, violent. Grace froze. Julian? Who are you? Julian asked. His voice was cracked, raw. I'm Grace, she said, a flicker of panic starting in her chest. I'm the same person I was this morning. No, you're not, Julian shook his head. The Grace I know worries about rent. The Grace I know saves coupons for pizza. The Grace I know, she trusts me. I do trust you, Grace pleaded. I did this for us. I needed to know if they would accept me for me, not for my money. You know how people are, Julian. If I had walked in here as Grace Vance, billionaire, your mother would have kissed my feet. I wouldn't have known the truth. So you tested me, Julian said. His eyes were wet. You tested me, Grace, not just them. You tested me. Grace paused. I had to be sure. Sure of what? Julian's voice rose, echoing in the empty hall. I proposed to you with a ring that cost me 3 months' salary. I was terrified it wasn't enough. I've been working double shifts to save for a wedding, stressing out about how we were going to afford a life together. And the whole time, you were sitting on $1 billion. I didn't want the money to change things. It changes everything, Julian shouted. It means every time I tried to pay for dinner and you pretended to struggle to split the bill, you were acting. It means every time we talked about our dreams, about maybe buying a small house one day, you were laughing inside. I was never laughing, Grace said, tears stinging her eyes. I just wanted a normal life. I wanted to be loved for me. I did love you for you, Julian cried. I loved the girl in the thrift store dress. I defended her tonight. I was ready to be disowned for her. I was ready to be poor for her. But that girl doesn't exist, does she? He gestured to Arthur, to the security guards, to the lawyers hovering in the background. This is who you are, Julian said softly, the anger draining out, replaced by exhaustion. You're a titan. You're a shark. You buy banks and destroy enemies. I destroyed them to protect you. You didn't protect me, Julian said. He looked at the door where his parents had been dragged out. You humiliated them. Yes, they are terrible people. God knows they are terrible. But you didn't just leave. You didn't just break up with me or tell the truth. You set a trap. You baited them. You enjoyed it. Grace opened her mouth to argue, but the words died in her throat. She looked at Arthur. Arthur looked away, unable to meet her gaze. Was he right? Had she enjoyed the power trip? Had she prioritized revenge over honesty? Julian, please. Grace stepped forward, tears finally spilling over. I can fix this. We can go anywhere. We can start over. I have a house in the south of France. We can leave tonight. Julian laughed, a sad, hollow sound. You still don't get it. You think you can buy a solution. That's exactly what my mother would do. The comparison hit Grace like a physical slap. Julian reached into his pocket. He pulled out the engagement ring. It was a modest diamond, small and slightly cloudy. He looked at it for a moment, then placed it gently on the table next to the half-eaten cake. I can't marry Grace Vance, the CEO, Julian said, his voice breaking. I don't know her. And honestly, I'm scared of her. Julian, don't, Grace sobbed. Goodbye, Grace. Julian turned and walked away. He didn't look back. He walked past the security guards, past the lawyers, and out the heavy oak doors into the night. Grace stood alone in the center of the massive, empty ballroom. She was wearing a ruined dress, surrounded by $1 billion worth of leverage and power. She had won the war against the Thorns. She had crushed her enemies. She was the most powerful woman in the room, and she had never felt more poor in her entire life. 3 months had passed since the catastrophe at the Chatsworth estate. The tabloids had a field day. Billionaire Bride Wars, the headlines read. The downfall of the Thorne family was swift and brutal. Edward and Victoria were facing suspended sentences, but were financially ruined. The estate was sold off to a developer. They were currently living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Queens, a fate Victoria considered worse than death. But Grace Vance wasn't reading the papers. She was sitting in her office on the 40th floor of the Vance Global Tower, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. She was miserable. She had tried to bury herself in work. She acquired 2 competitors and launched a new charity foundation. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the look on Julian's face. You're exactly what my mother would do. Miss Vance, Arthur stood at the door. The helicopter is ready to take you to the Hamptons for the weekend. Cancel it, Grace said, not turning around. Cancel it? Arthur blinked. But the gala. I said cancel it, Arthur. Grace spun her chair around. Where is he? Arthur sighed. He knew who she meant. He had been keeping tabs, under strict orders not to interfere, but just to watch. He's working at a landscaping company in New Jersey, Arthur said quietly. He's living in a studio apartment above a bakery. He hasn't dated anyone else. Grace stood up. She looked at her reflection in the glass. She was wearing a $5,000 Armani suit. She looked powerful. She looked impeccable. I'm done acting, Grace said. I'm done testing people. What are you going to do? Arthur asked. I'm going to tell the truth. It was raining in New Jersey when the Blacktown car pulled up to the small landscaping depot. It wasn't a Rolls-Royce. It was just a car. Grace stepped out. She wasn't wearing a thrift store dress to test him. She wasn't wearing a power suit to intimidate him. She was wearing jeans and a sweater. Her hair was down. She wore no makeup. She saw him. Julian was loading bags of mulch into a truck. He looked tired. He had lost weight. He wore a neon yellow vest and work boots covered in mud. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. This was terrifying. Buying a company was easy. This was hard. She walked across the wet pavement. Julian turned. He saw her. He froze, a bag of mulch in his arms. For a long minute, neither of them moved. The rain fell between them. "Are you here to buy the landscaping company?" Julian asked, his voice guarded, but not angry. "Just tired." "No," Grace said. "I'm here to apply for a job." Julian frowned. "What?" "I heard you need a partner," Grace said, her voice trembling slightly. "Someone to help carry the load. I'm not very good at lifting mulch, but I'm a fast learner. And I promise, no secrets, no tests, no masks." Julian dropped the bag of mulch into the truck bed with a thud. He wiped his dirty hands on his pants. He looked at her, really looked at her, searching for the deception. "Why are you here, Grace?" "Because I'm poor," Grace said. Julian scoffed. "Right. The billionaire is poor." "I am." Grace stepped closer, disregarding the mud that was getting on her boots. "I have houses I don't sleep in. I have cars I don't drive. I have money I don't need. But I don't have the one thing that made me feel rich. I don't have my best friend." She stopped 2 feet away from him. "I was wrong, Julian. I was so afraid that you were like them, that I became like them. I used my money as a weapon. I'm sorry. I don't want you to marry Grace Vance, the CEO. I want you to marry Grace, the girl who loves you. And if you want, I'll give it all away. I'll walk away from Vance Global tomorrow if it means I can wake up next to you." Julian looked at her. He saw the rain matting her hair. He saw the desperation in her eyes. He saw the woman he had fallen in love with in the coffee shop 2 years ago. "You'd really give it up?" Julian asked softly. "In a heartbeat," Grace whispered. Julian stood there for a long, agonizing moment. Then he shook his head. "Don't give it up," he said. Grace's heart sank. "Julian." "Don't give it up," Julian repeated, stepping closer. "Because you worked hard for it. Because you're brilliant. Because the world needs women like you running things." He reached out and took her hand. His hand was rough, calloused, and dirty. Her hand was soft. "Just don't use it to hide from me anymore," Julian said. "If we do this, we do it as equals. You run the world during the day, but at night, you're just Elle, and we split the dinner bill, 50-50. Grace let out a sob that was half laugh. 50-50, I can do that." Julian smiled, and the sun seemed to break through the grey clouds. He pulled her into his arms, pressing her clean sweater against his muddy vest. He kissed her, and it tasted like rain and forgiveness. "You know," Julian whispered against her ear, "my mom is going to have a heart attack when she finds out we're back together." Grace laughed, burying her face in his neck. "Well, we can always send her a get-well card. I think I can afford the postage." Grace and Julian were married 6 months later. It wasn't at the Chatsworth estate. It was a small ceremony in a public park. Grace wore a simple white dress, silk this time, not polyester, and Julian wore a suit he bought off the rack. There were no paparazzi, no press releases, just their closest friends. Victoria and Edward were not invited. They read about it in the newspaper from their cramped apartment in Queens. Beatrice tried to sell a tell-all story to a tabloid, but Grace's lawyers shut it down with a single phone call. Grace kept running Vance Global, but she changed. She stopped hiding. She started a program to help underprivileged entrepreneurs, people who were judged by their clothes rather than their ideas. And every year, on their anniversary, Grace and Julian went to a diner. They ordered burgers and fries, and when the check came, Grace Vance, one of the richest women in the world, checked her wallet to make sure she had a coupon. Because true wealth isn't about what's in your bank account. It's about who is sitting across the table from you. Like this story? If you enjoyed this twist-filled drama of revenge and redemption, please hit the like button. It helps us create more stories like this. Don't forget to share this with a friend who needs a reminder that karma is real, and subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. What would you have done if you were Grace? Let us know in the comments below.